Welcome to The Deep End by On Deck, a podcast where visionary builders, creators, and experts discuss world-changing ideas. I'm your host, Marshall Kozlov. Let's dive in.
It's sort of TBD on, can you create like a Harry Potter, Marvel quality experience in this decentralized kind of DAO way? I'm hopeful, right? Like I'm hopeful that we will figure out how to get these things moving, and a lot of these things will be quite interesting to people. But the sort of history shows that like some of the best quality content is done in this very centralized, almost dictatorial way, where you have kind of an auteur who basically says, this is what we're doing, right? Seinfeld or Quentin Tarantino or Christopher Nolan or J.K. Rowling, right? Like just saying, this is, I'm in charge of every single pixel or word in this piece of art.
At The Deep End, we're creating a space where we skip the surface level and go in depth into ideas that inspire people to build. I'll be your guide as we explore possible futures of internet communities, creator tools, climate tech, longevity, and much, much more. There are no experts in uncharted territory, only pioneers. The Deep End invites these trailblazers to turn their experiences into the knowledge and ideas that others need to start their own founder odysseys. Joining me this week in The Deep End is Sahil Lavingia, CEO of Gumroad and author of The Minimalist Entrepreneur. Many of our recent guests are recently forged pioneers of the creator economy space, but Sahil has been building in the passion economy since before it was cool. In 2011, Sahil founded Gumroad to help creators sell content directly to consumers. He was 19 at the time. But this episode isn't strictly about the passion economy, though we do chat about things like gatekeepers and shifting creator incentives. Much of today's discussion is Sahil reflecting on his ambitions to build a billion-dollar company. Though Gumroad today is widely used by creators of all different sizes, its success story is not without growing pains. A decade ago, he raised venture-backed money to try to scale Gumroad at light speed. He details the lessons learned trying to keep up with the aggressive timeline of venture capital firms. For better or for worse, he found that Gumroad only grew as quickly as the market determined they would grow. Now, he fancies himself a minimalist entrepreneur, elaborating on what that means in today's episode and in his new book. Sahil Lavingia, welcome to The Deep End.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
We don't really do book episodes that often, but it's really cool that you wrote a book. We'll get a bit into the process. So we'll just start at its most basic level. Your book is The Minimalist Entrepreneur. What is minimal entrepreneurship?
Yeah. I think minimalist entrepreneurship is the combination of entrepreneurship, business ownership, and then minimalism, which is like almost like paradoxical, like lack of ownership, right? Like not owning things. Because I just like I love entrepreneurship. I think everyone should kind of start a business. I think it's kind of, equity ownership and all these things are kind of like the most guaranteed path to wealth creation. But I also think like, the kind of traditional way that people think about business ownership and entrepreneurship, just not accessible to most people. Right. So I wanted to come up with sort of a framing that allowed many more people to see themselves as an entrepreneur in a way that like allows them to do other things in their life and live where they want, in a way that maybe like the traditional definition of entrepreneurship wouldn't. And so, for example, like the creator economy, I think is a great example of this, right? Where a creator is really an entrepreneur. It's a kind of a creative CEO entrepreneur person, right? But it feels much more accessible, right? Like if you ask most high school kids, do you want to be an entrepreneur? I would say 5% would say yes. But if you ask them, do you want to be a YouTuber?
I knew you were going to use that example. That is the Twitter poll that goes around every once in a while.
Exactly. Who knows how true it is, right? There's probably a little bit of anecdata there, but yeah, generally, I think the goal is just making business ownership as open to as many people as possible, because I do think it's kind of the most meritocratic thing there is.
And the key thing is that you really come to the minimalist entrepreneurship framework through your experience leading Gumroad. So first, what is Gumroad? And then just to tell stories for the audience, what is basically the first half of your Gumroad experience, which is the more traditional venture-backed startup billion-dollar company IPO version? And then what is the second half once that first vision didn't work?
Yeah, totally. So Gumroad is a creator economy company. We help digital content creators, musicians, designers, writers, filmmakers, photographers, stand-up comedians, et cetera, sell content directly to their audiences through social media, their blog, newsletter, and all the other places they may interact with their following. We were one of the early creator economy companies. I believe we were the third company to use the word creator to sort of reference our users after Kickstarter and YouTube. And the first half of the company, so the first sort of four or so years of the company, very kind of traditional venture-backed startup, right? So moved to the Bay Area, was living in San Francisco and Soma, raised $10 million of venture capital from a bunch of Silicon Valley investors, hired a team, tried to scale as fast as possible, had a couple great years, had a couple not so great years. In 2015, we went out to raise our Series B, and then basically failed miserably, like kind of a shock to the system in a sense where we realized, oh, wow, like we didn't have the sort of 20% month over month growth that investors really needed to see at our scale and stage, and just how long we'd been around to kind of make the next bet. And I wrote about this whole journey in this essay that I published in 2019 called Reflecting on My Failure to Build a $1 billion Company, which kind of details a lot of this. But basically, VC is like a double or nothing game, right? You kind of keep playing the odds over and over again, and the sort of the stakes get higher and higher in this kind of exponential curve. And we just kind of weren't hitting those numbers. We were kind of growing slightly more than linear or so. Still a great business, right? Still like a multi-million dollar. Now we're at 11 million ARR. Like we just raised a crowdfunding round, 5 million at $100 million valuation. So we're doing great, but certainly not kind of like the venture backed, as you mentioned, kind of like the IPO kind of outcome that everyone wanted. And so in 2015, we ended up downsizing the company instead of choosing to shut down or sell, slim down from 20 people down to 5, and then 5 to just me. And then from 2016 to kind of 2020, I had kind of just grown the company using freelancers and contractors around the world. And then COVID happened. So 2020 was kind of a big year for us. We grew 87% year over year. And all of a sudden we were kind of, the creator economy was like a buzzword, and, people started paying more attention. And I, instead of going back on the old path, I sort of started thinking about, well, what's kind of a new thing that I can do? I now have an audience, now regulation crowdfunding exists. Like a lot of things have changed in the world. Obviously Web3, crypto, et cetera. Like what made, company building look like in the future? And that's kind of the last year or so, I think, where I've tried to kind of experiment with more.
This is really interesting. There's a couple different areas I'd like to go. So in no particular order, talk about the equity crowdfunding model. Because what's interesting to me about what you're talking about here is I was going to ask the obvious question of, but how do you raise money if you're not going to create this big exit opportunity? But kind of the point to the minimalist part of the entrepreneur argument would probably be that you shouldn't be creating this massively expensive, massively headcount built. You're not having to hire 20 engineers to create the type of product you're working on. So speak about the type of funding models that make sense given the fact that there isn't going to be that very obvious home run exit opportunity down the line.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of businesses fall into this bucket where Gumroad falls, which is we're not probably going to go 100x or 1000x or whatever kind of the VC, home run kind of looks like. Right, the Slack, Uber, Airbnb, Pinterest, Stripe, et cetera story. But we're also probably not, like a grocery store or like a bootstrapped, flower shop. Nothing wrong with those, but we're kind of growing, between 40 and 100% year over year. Like that's, pretty significant, right? Very few businesses grow at that rate. You kind of need to be a software business to do that with some sort of organic growth channel. And I think, those businesses are still like, if you think about, sort of investing in the public stock market, like a 40% year over year growth is much better than, your returns would be generally if you're investing in the public stock market, like an ETF or something like that. And so there are a lot of retail investors who are not VCs. They're not looking for, that 100x or 1000x, but they are trying to get good returns. And I think Gumroad can provide them with exceptional returns compared to what retail investors generally get access to, right? Because again, like I'm not raising from VCs, though even in the last round, I did have some VCs participate because, it was open to anyone who wanted to participate. But I think, if Gumroad continues to grow at 20, 30, 40, 50% year over year for the next few years, like that's going to be a great return for our investors. It might be a 2x, a 3x, or, like IRR will be 20 to 30%, which I think will be very strong. And actually, kind of ironically, a venture fund that has 20 to 30% IRR is actually considered a very successful firm. It's just that they need the big win that is the 1000x to kind of make that IRR happen because they're investing in so many different companies. Individual investors don't have that constraint, right? Because they're generally investing themselves. They're putting their own personal capital in. So they're making money per deal versus a VC is a basket of deals that have to work out kind of holistically, right? And so that's kind of how I thought about it was, look, Gumroad, if we raised $5 million, I think we would be able to grow the team a little bit, do, a little bit more with the product, take a few more risks. And, in the coming few months, I think people will start to see a lot of those things play out in the public. And will that mean the product, starts growing like crazy? I have no idea. Like, no, probably not, right? Just statistically unlikely, but people want to invest in the thing. Daniel Vassallo, I think he said it best. He's like, I kind of consider it like a Kickstarter, except I get some equity. Like, it's almost like I want this thing to get better. I already use it. It helps me. I'm putting in $1,000, it's 7,000 people putting in, hundreds, if not, less than $1,000 on average, which means that no one is, betting their shirt on this thing, but collectively, that's a very meaningful amount where we can do quite a lot of stuff with. And if it does work, then, everyone ends up better off for it as well. Right. And so I think I like that kind of middle ground where I think there are actually a lot of companies that could benefit from a little bit of capital, but unfortunately to do that, you often need to raise money from a singular set of people who are all looking for that 100x, 1000x. And then you end up sort of positioning your business in a way that, maybe doesn't make as much sense or the risk is kind of, not where it should be. Or, I think actually the biggest downside is your customers don't want you to, right? Like often your customers are the ones who are like, no, don't do, like, we're happy with what you built. We don't need all these crazy features. We don't, you say you're adding all these features and then we don't need them all. And then 6 months later, you say we're increasing our pricing because we have all these new features that I never asked for, right? Like this often happens in these venture-backed startup stories, right? I see it even as a customer of them with Gumroad. I'm like, oh, great, But I'm hopeful that maybe in the future, like crowdfunding and some of these other things will make it easier to kind of carve out this independent path. And ultimately, it's up to you as the founder of the company and the person raising the money to say, look, this is what we want to do with the money, right? It's always opt-in. No one has to invest, and people can choose to, and it seems like the demand to do that was there. We ended up raising, the $5 million cap in 12 hours with $1,000 maximum check size limit.
Wow.
So,
and this is where this gets interesting because when you're giving this minimalist entrepreneurship framework, in a certain way, you basically reference that there's a world where you can make a different choice with Gumroad now, because it's very easy to say, hey, Gumroad didn't work. 2015 was 2015. You were correct directionally in that the creator economy became this whole big thing. The space is a million times bigger than it was even in 2011, 2015, 2016, 2017. So given that dynamic, why do you think that you still prefer to go the specific? Why are you less confident in the ability of a company that serves creators in the way that you're serving them to go all the way with that previous sort of framework?
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe I'm just too jaded from being the CEO of a creator economy company for so long. And then, 10 years in kind of getting okay, cool. People kind of use the word creator and know what it means. I don't have to explain it over and over and over again to everybody. But I just think, I think it's a really hard market I think, ultimately one of the lines from that essay I wrote that resonated with a lot of people, maybe more than any other sentence, was, it doesn't matter how awesome your team is or how fast you ship features, the market you're in is going to determine most of your growth, right? And I think Gumroad and I think this often happens to companies. You kind of get put into a bucket in terms of, okay, this is what problem you solve, and you become the default for that thing, right? It might be Teachable for courses, it might be Patreon for memberships, it might be Substack for newsletters, it might be Gumroad for digital content, ebooks, etc. And it's just that last market is just, we probably directionally were correct on the creator economy, but we probably, in terms of where the GMV ended up being, we're just wrong in terms of where the mass adoption was going to be, right? Like we started before Patreon, but we focused on single product sales. And then, we actually had subscriptions, but it wasn't something we really talked about pretty broadly. And then Patreon came around and did a really amazing job kind of dominating that vertical. And I still, have high hopes for Gumroad, obviously, but the way that I think about it now is I want to focus on just improving the product, like making the product better for, the customers that currently use the product. My goal is not to build a sales team, try to find, creators who don't use the platform, convince them to, try to make these big swings in terms of like, we're going to totally redefine the way that we, the product works, and, the product visionary kind of Steve Jobsian approach. Like my goal is kind of bottoms up, like hire creators, let them run wild with the product, improve the product as much as possible. And part of it is just, I believe that, creators did us a favor, like in 2015 when, everyone else kind of wrote it off, almost including, basically including myself. Like I was kind of just running it as like a, doing customer support and like, keeping the lights on sort of thing. Our creators, stuck with us. Actually, we grew, 15%, 25%, 40% year over year because we solved their problems. So I almost just feel like I owe it to them to not say, oh, we have a shot. Now the markets are crazy. I could go raise a bunch of money and try to like hire a big engineering team and like go, at the largest opportunity there is. I'd rather kind of still continue like the philosophy that we have now, which is like experiment, hire creators, improve the product in this very incremental way. And then, maybe things will change. Like, just like I couldn't have predicted COVID, which really changed the direction of the business for us and many creator economy companies. I think, who knows, right? Like, let's just keep the light, let's keep going and see what happens. And be in a place where, I want the business to be sustainable so that I will be around and we will have the energy to continue to react to these changes in the macro environment, because ultimately the macro environment, I think, is what dictates, a lot of these big decisions and big outcomes.
Speaking of ebooks, it's very interesting to me as someone who hosts a bunch of podcasts. I interact with publishers a lot, and you went through a traditional publisher to publish this book. And within tech circles, that's a bit of a narrative violation, shall we say, in the sense that when we put on my pure anti-establishment shill take, which is, wait a second, you've got a huge Twitter following, you obviously have a real audience, you're capable of literally crowdfunding from that audience. Why do you need a traditional gatekeeping publisher to distribute your book? Also, like the article that the book basically turned into received more than 1 million views. Why did you participate in the legacy system, given that you actually run a company that literally exists to distribute around that gatekeeping factor?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Honestly, I think my goals for the book were to get my ideas in front of a totally new audience that was less familiar with even some of the things that we would maybe consider obvious, right? Like if you're on Twitter, if you follow people like me and Naval, and you're familiar with On Deck and these sorts of things, like Figma, Notion, no code creator economy, but like the vast majority of the world doesn't, right? We're very early in a lot of these trends, right? And so I wanted to write a book that really was for like high school kids and like college students and like people who were really like people like my mom who were like starting to get interested in tech, could see it start to pop up in different places, but we're still very unfamiliar with what it takes, would probably never raise venture capital, would never consider that, as an opportunity for them. But I think would benefit tremendously from being able to start and own their own business. And so I think the best way for me to have done that was to work with a traditional publisher like Penguin Random House in this case, and kind of try to put the book in a place where it could get seen, airports and bookstores and these places that like, if you do follow me on Twitter, like you already know all my ideas, right? Frankly, right? Like you don't maybe even need the book. And it's kind of this hard thing actually, because like my book is kind of for people who don't already know who I am. So how do I get it in front of them? Which I think I don't know the answer necessarily to that question. My goal is to kind of just write a really, really good book and then hope that it gets there, right? People share it with maybe their one friend who they think would benefit from it or something like that. And then I would say the other thing is I really wanted to write like an incredible, and similar to Gumroad actually, where, my goal was to just write the highest quality book possible. And I felt like working with a traditional publisher, they're not going to really drive any marketing value in the short term. Like that's really all on me. But I do think that they helped create the book and make it much higher quality than it would have been if it was just me doing it, right? In terms of the cover, in terms of the audiobook, there was just a lot more kind of, effort that went into the book than I would have done. The beauty of what I've done, similar to like how I did raise VC and now I crowdfunded, is maybe I don't do that for my next book if I have another book. Like I now know exactly what it takes to write a book and typeset it and bind it and like literally, record the audiobook. Like I've gone through the entire process from 0 to 1. And so maybe from 1 to 2, I decide to kind of, now I have the credibility of Penguin Random House as an author. I don't need it for every single book. So maybe my next project, I decide not to, but I do think, and this is, by the way, like I'll be kind of, I don't know, vulnerable might not be the right word, but, one of the things I learned with Gumroad came with this sort of theory, right? Which is in this world in which creators are able to interact directly with their audiences, you don't need labels. You don't need publishers. You don't need all of these gatekeepers because you can now sell directly to your audience. Why do you need, if you have TikTok, why do you need Hollywood, right? In a sense, and what I learned the hard way with Gumroad as a company is that those service providers still provide a very, very valuable service, just like VCs do, which is a branding thing, right? It's basically, there's so much noise. And what they can do is they can give you some capital, but 2, they can give you a badge of approval, a stamp of approval that other people can look at and say, oh, okay, cool. Of all the 1,000 founders I've seen, these are the 10 Y Combinator founders, right? Or of all the people applying to this job, these are the people who went to an Ivy League school. Again, not saying that's the right approach. It's certainly not the right approach, actually. But everyone is looking for these shortcuts in terms of like filtering the information that's thrown at them on a daily basis, right? It might be how many Twitter followers do you have? Are you verified, right? There are all of these different signals that we look at. And I think that is sort of the role of a publisher in today's ecosystem, is to basically, very similar to VCs, I would argue they would be better suited to kind of stop pretending that they add value and just say, look, we just help you. We just give you the stamp of approval and we give you some capital. The other thing that I'll give a lot of credit to publishers for is that most books don't work, right? Maybe the failure rate is even higher than startups. and so
without the 100,000x return.
Exactly. And you don't even, exactly. Right. You maybe have like one Harry Potter, like, every 20 years or something like this, but it's insanely rare. But that Harry Potter pays for the advances for all of this other content, all of these other authors to get a shot on goal that they otherwise would not have been able to get, which I actually think is sad. Like I wish the industry was more sort of fundamentally like self-sustainable, in which authors could kind of pursue it. I mean, I've talked to so many authors, and almost no one makes a living as a full-time author. They make it some other way. They have it as a side hustle. This is one of the reasons I'm so excited about Web3, is potentially maybe, I think Gumroad nailed some trends, but it's clear that like we're still very early on this journey as a society of figuring out like, how do we value artists? How do we make it so that the business model behind creativity and content creation is sustainable so that we can get more of it, right? And right now it's kind of like we expect, Disney is 80% of the box office, right? I mean, that doesn't seem correct to me, but it is what it is right now, right? And so, yeah, I think a lot about that. And it was tough. Yeah. Even as the Gumroad CEO being like, I'm going to traditionally publish a book and not use Gumroad for it. Like, but I also needed to be honest with myself about, look, like that, that's the right thing for the book, not maybe, for me as the Gumroad CEO, but I need to be, from a first principles basis, I need to be making like the right decision for the ideas in the book, because that's kind of who I'm trying to serve.
I will say I got my advanced copy of the book from you, and I used Gumroad to do that. And it was a really great experience. So there was a mini
Thank you. Yes, I did use Gumroad for a lot of the pre-order stuff, so it was fun.
That was great. Like seriously, that was a legitimately good experience. Something that I'm really wondering about here, and I just want to make a quick comment. I was speaking to someone in traditional publishing. Listeners may be wondering why we're harping on this book publishing thing, and the reason why this came up is this publisher, top tier publisher, works in this space, basically said it's very difficult for us to convince people, frankly, like you, to want to do book deals, given a lot of the dynamics that you have. So you're thinking of maybe someone's at Barstool Sports or someone's in these spaces because they're really thinking, hey, I have my big audience. Like you said, what are you providing? So I just appreciated how you just gave a really, I think a publisher should honestly like clip the segment where you talked about the value add, because you actually got to the heart of it, which is people use the word or the phrase airport book in a disparaging sense, but the way you articulate it just means distribution. It means exposure. It means, hey, it's great that you have a really great Twitter thread about your book, but the question is that thread going to reach new people who haven't read it before? So I just think your framework there was really strongly theoretical, and I really suggest people think a lot about that. But just to, let's go into the, not quite Web3, but more just the space. So 2011, you leave Pinterest, your stock doesn't vest, you see something going on in the creator space before it was cool. What did you see that was broken or missing then, and now sitting in the year 2021? And this is where everything from Web3 to the metaverse to passion economy to creator economy, pick your buzzword of the day / week. What do you see as broken or where there's a lot of green space right now?
Yeah. I mean, in 2011, the biggest thing that I saw was people building an audience, some people even becoming like legitimately famous without having a website on the internet, right? Like before, sort of pre-2011, like the way that you started building an audience on the internet was with a website, right? The first thing you had to do was like buy a domain, get like a host, and then, set up a blog or a website or a newsletter or something, and then, write blogs and, RSS feeds. And like, that was like the way that people, consume content and created content and distribution, through blog rolls and things like that. That's kind of how it happened back in the day. There was like Technorati, there's like the top 100 blogs. Like it was a very different, this is like pre-Twitter even, right? And, or at least sort of mainstream Twitter. And yeah, I was just shocked that like every e-commerce tool assumed that you needed a website, right? So PayPal was like, embed our button on your website, right? Like all of these tools required that. And all of a sudden I felt like, okay, well, there's going to be a new class of people. They're going to have audiences. They're going to have stuff to sell, and they're not going to have websites. They're going to have Twitter accounts and YouTube accounts and Reddit accounts and Pinterest accounts and Instagram accounts. And they're going to need to sell, and they're not going to be able to, because this kind of assumption is now no longer true, right? Like these people no longer have websites. And that's kind of why I built Gumroad, and kind of the epiphany that I had was like, there needs to be kind of like a bit.ly for commerce, basically a way for people to sell directly on Twitter or any of these channels that they may already be using in this kind of native way. And in some ways, I think I was correct. In other ways, I think I got it wrong in some sort of macro ways. For example, one thing I thought was going to happen was, we went after sort of 4 different verticals in the beginning. We went after film, publishing, music, and software, which we broadly kind of, and it's funny because they almost map to different cities. You have publishing in New York, you have music and film in LA, you have software in San Francisco. And one thing I underestimated was the convenience of a single place you could go to and get it all in one transaction. For example, Netflix, right? What ended up happening was not that every indie filmmaker was building an audience and then selling directly, though they were building an audience, they would actually still, the commerce ended up flowing through a centralized sort of.
And a quick thing, they would leverage that audience to get a Netflix deal.
Exactly.
That's the key part. That I get.
Exactly.
I get why
You're totally right.
And
Same thing with TikTok. And you could argue I did the same thing with my own book, right? Like, it turns out that the demand side, the consumers, they have very different incentives and think they care about convenience. They don't necessarily care about the economics, right? And of how the industry works. And so something like Netflix or Kindle, right? These verticalized solutions are very convenient. They're not as creator friendly. You don't get the emails of the buyers, et cetera, but, creators or consumers vastly prefer those. Right. And so that was kind of a hard lesson that we kind of learned over the kind of the journey of the company. And that's honestly where kind of, I think.
So wait, could we, yeah. I want to spend a second here, because this is like a fascinating what if of like tech, like media history. So back in 2011, did you see a world where people would sell like major films on the platform? So you would sell, I guess it basically makes sense, because it's hard if everything is about the creator. So if the central brand, so if what really matters is, I mean, Larry David is a little too legacy here, but like, once again, Larry David's the central thing. The question is like, Larry David, like, why do you need to go to a big publisher or a big, media company and not get as much money when you could just go directly to a platform? But that's not how things went. So this is just like I'd never thought of that as the alternate model, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, honestly, that's what we thought was going to happen. We thought that, for example, someone like Taylor Swift or Eminem or Marvel, you want to watch their movie and they can reach their audience. And so therefore they're going to want 95+% of the economics, not 70% or 30%, like some of these, like these marketplaces.
Movie theaters, that's that whole thing.
Exactly. Movie theaters or iTunes or all of these different sort of Redbox, et cetera. Like, they're not making a lot of money off those things generally as a percentage. And we just didn't see that. Like, we didn't see that, when we did have some experiments run on smaller films that kind of did this, where they would go kind of direct to their audience, but it just didn't align, I think, with the consumer behavior. The consumer behavior is not necessarily like, I'm browsing Twitter, I see a movie, like a filmmaker say that they want, they have a new movie out and I go consume that movie. They're actually like, I want to go watch a movie. I'm going to go on Netflix, or I'm going to go to the theater and see what movies are there. Like, I think I underrated how important the consumer behavior was. And I overrated maybe how sort of like how much power the creator had to influence it, in a sense, right? Like, consumers want a certain thing, a certain way, and they're in a certain mind space. And Twitter actually like learned a similar thing. We were actually piloted buying on Twitter. If you like the buy button on Twitter, we did it in 2013 or 2014. There's like a big New York Times piece about it. We worked with like Andy Weir of The Martian and helped sell books directly on Twitter. And one thing we all learned was that, and Twitter has kind of learned this, I think, with super follows again, is that people are not on Twitter to buy stuff. Nope. They're on Twitter to like waste time.
No one's tipping, no one's super following.
Yeah, it's just not what people use Twitter for. And for that consumer behavior, honestly, the best model turns out to be advertising, because people are giving their attention to this thing and they're not looking to pay money. They're not looking to like enter a new storefront and buy a product. And, like, it's just a very different kind of thing. And so people have tried this, over and over again, and it just doesn't seem to have worked in the way that maybe we would like. And, kind of fast forwarding to sort of 2021, maybe the answer is not necessarily to say, hey, creators deserve better economics, but to say creators actually own Netflix, right? And this is kind of a lot of the Web3 discussions that are happening right now, is like, maybe we can get the best of both worlds. The answer is somehow we have to eat our cake and have it too, right? And maybe the way to do that is to have the economics that Gumroad wanted, to be able to fulfill for everybody, right? Creators being able to make 95% of the sort of top line, but the consumers also get what they want in this sort of Netflix-like model where it's all you can eat, and these sorts of things, right? And so it's still honestly kind of crazy to me, because obviously as a culture, we massively value music, we massively value film, we massively value art and all of these things. I would argue that they are the most valued in the sense that, like, in the pandemic, when people say what they miss the most, it's often those sorts of things, right? Going to a concert, going to, these sorts of things. And yet we still, I feel like, in startups and B2B software, like, we figured out the business model, right? We've like done so many iterations on the business model with like SaaS and recurring billing and D2C. And like, there's so many transitions on the model, usage-based pricing. And we have yet, I think the creator economy and all these creative industries really still, I think, like, it's like we're doing basically what we were doing in the 50s, right? Like a movie ticket, right? You pay some amount of money to go to a theater and watch a movie. And this is how like Dune makes $500 million. I mean, it's like a very old school, way of thinking. And maybe that means it's a Lindy, maybe it's anti-fragile, maybe that's because that's perfect and we nailed it and there's no way to actually improve on the model. But my guess is there are improvements to be had there. I would like to at least think as a creative person myself, that there's kind of room to play in terms of where this model goes. And I can talk about this even like publishing.
No.
I think it feels broken to me in many ways. Right. So,
I mean, I'm obsessed with this because you've actually gotten at some of the difficulties that people are running into in the Web3 space. Because I'm not going to say these are quite contradictions, but there's a slightly awkward dynamic here, which is that what you're essentially getting at with the pitfalls of the creator economy pre-2021 is, I would basically interpret as most customers, they just want to be entertained. They just want products. They do not care. If there are structural imbalances in the creator economy or broader like entertainment media industry, they're just not things that actual customers care about. Therefore, solving for those imbalances doesn't inherently make something better. So the question here for me is, what comes first? Because there's the Henry Ford quote, which is cliche, but it does mean something, which is if I'd asked, what people what they would have wanted, I'm not sure this is Henry Ford, but they would have asked for a faster horse rather than a different car. Or I'm confusing it. It's the Model A, like it only comes in black. You're basically like, you're a visionary, you're making a statement. How does that work in these creators / Web3 spaces? Because I'm sorry, you can say Netflix media DAO all you want. If the product isn't actually good, that isn't going to make any difference. And I see no evidence that at a creator level, and I think this is probably why you've seen a lot of creators who are bigger sort of struggle to get into the Web3 space. I don't know why a Web3 Netflix produces better content than Web2 Netflix. Yeah. I don't know why the finances are better. The distribution is definitely weaker. If you're LeBron James, you could make your own production company, and you'll own 100% of that, and it won't be on a DAO and it won't be Vibey, but you'll still get good deals with Netflix. So how does all this basically come? This isn't particularly coherent, but how does all of this come together?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And it reminds me a lot, honestly, of even before Ethereum and NFTs and Web3, the conversations around Bitcoin, right? Because even when sort of Gumroad launched, there was kind of a conversation around like, well, in this world in which everyone, and actually I remember even talking to Naval back when he invested in 2011, and we talked about Bitcoin, and we basically were kind of pretty much believers in this idea that stores would no longer need to exist because you would basically be able to buy everything one item at a time, right? Because like effectively, why would these stores exist? You needed to bundle these things up because like there was kind of some level of activation energy to like walk into a store, and so it was just very inefficient if you just bought every single, you entered and walked in, for every single item. But in this new world, with zero, basically no 30% credit card fee or 30-cent credit card fee, et cetera, like you can kind of have this like micro transactions, right? And Bitcoin often was associated with these things like, you would be in traffic and you could like pay the person in front of you to get moved to the right so you could go forward, right? Like that was a lot of those early conversations. And even, by the way, microtransactions has not played out at all on the internet, right? Yeah. Like that was like a huge, there's so many, tipping startups and this and that. And like none of them have really reached any semblance of scale because, again, consumers don't really want it. And I think
And to just add one thing, it's not only that consumers don't want it, but it's unclear that a business driven by that function performs its core functions any better.
Yes.
So, a New York Times, which once again, like there's always beef within tech about the New York Times, but a New York Times that's driven by subscriptions versus a New York Times that has tipping. I'm not sure why the tipping one is any better than the subscription driven one.
Yeah, no, you're right. And this is something, we learned the hard way with credit cards is like they suck for merchants. One, that you have fees, right? Effectively, there's kind of a Visa tax where they charge, 2 to 3% per transaction on everything. They do like $11 trillion, like some insane volume a year. And they're, $500 billion company or something like this. And there's chargebacks, right? So like someone can buy your product and then you give it to them and then they charge it back. I mean, there's like and there's risk and fraud associated with that. There's like fee, like it's just not an ideal customer, not creator experience or merchant experience. And so Bitcoin's incredibly appealing to Gumroad, to merchants in theory, but basically has zero traction even today with actual transactions. Why? Because it doesn't provide, I think to your point, I think you said it well, like one, it's not a better user experience for consumers. No consumer prefers Bitcoin over a credit card. A credit card is a phenomenal user experience once you have a credit card. It's amazing. You can go anywhere in the world, basically swipe your credit card. And, people can complain, oh, it's not secure and this and that. But it's an amazing user experience. Like you kind of just have to admit that. And the user is not paying the 3% or, the 30 cents or what have you. So why do they care? They don't. Right. And then, to your point, exactly. Like there's nothing that sort of the restaurant, the movie theater, like they're not bottlenecked by like their payment method in terms of being able to provide a better service. And you're totally right. Like ultimately Netflix, Disney, like these huge organizations, Penguin Random House, in the case of my book, like they can provide they create the best quality products. And Web3 and sort of decentralization, I think it's sort of TBD on, can you create like a Harry Potter, Marvel quality experience in this decentralized kind of DAO way? I'm hopeful. Right? Like I'm hopeful that we will figure out how to get these things moving. And a lot of these things will be quite interesting to people. But the sort of history shows that like some of the best quality content is done in this very centralized, almost dictatorial way where you have kind of an auteur who basically says, this is what we're doing, right? Seinfeld or Quentin Tarantino or Christopher Nolan or J.K. Rowling, right? Like just saying this is, I'm in charge of every single pixel or word in this piece of art. And I definitely think there are interesting components of community ownership and equity and things like this that I definitely are worth talking about more. But and I love the secondary aspect, the secondary sales. I think there are a lot of interesting business model implications there as well. And I'm thinking a lot about those. But ultimately, you have to, if you are, building for this world, you want to build for the creator economy. I think the important question to ask is not like, can we have a better economic model? Because yes, you definitely can have a better economic model, but like, can you have an economic model that leads to a better quality product that consumers prefer, right? Do consumers actually prefer going to your decentralized social network over Twitter? Do they prefer going to your decentralized video platform over YouTube or Netflix or TikTok? And the answer today is not yet, right? And it's just, look, like I would love to be I'm super optimistic. I love investing in startups. Like I would have every reason to say it's possible, and I believe it is. But as a founder of a company too, like in the creator economy, like you also have to be realistic with what the market looks like and what consumers are willing to pay for and what they want, and ultimately they like going to theaters, right? Like they may want very different things than you may want as an entrepreneur.
It's funny. It's not that this is pessimistic. It's basically just the spaces we're talking about are hyper theoretical. So you actually can, to a certain degree, say there's customer and then there's actually like improved experience. And you should actually think about using that as a metric here. So as I'm realizing this takes us back to your point about publishers and why they're successful. It's not just that they're dictatorial. It's that they have a business model where there's going to be a lot of misses. and very few hits. They are hyper set up. The centralized platforms
Yes.
in all of the categories we're talking about
Mhm.
are made for, maybe the minimalist entrepreneur like doesn't super crush it,
Yeah.
but like Scott Galloway's book, which is also a portfolio book last year, I do too much publishing stuff. That does really well. So that could subsidize the effort that you're putting forth there too. So I don't see, once again, in these quite categories, how Web3 can
Yeah.
solve for that. So I think this would take us back to the framework here, which is that you set this up in the book really well, which is that, look, there are companies which are going to get that 1000x return. There are industries, there are categories, then there are categories which may make more sense in the minimalist sense. So if we can put different companies or different industries into different buckets as you see it, what are industries and spaces that you can see as being exciting for Web3? So like we can probably say we both agree that Web3 Netflix probably isn't quite there yet. But what is a space where you say, hey, as a category, the enhanced experience, but also the economics will be better under Web3 conditions?
Yeah, honestly, it's a good question. And I don't know the exact answer to that because it is so hyper theoretical, as you said. I would say gaming is probably the most evident one in which people are clearly spending a lot of time and attention and money on digital assets and skins and these sorts of things in game. And it makes sense to me that, you could see a world in which those assets are owned by the user instead of the game publisher, and they can manipulate the rules and nerf them and make them, change the kind of the sort of the different things there. I also think in that world, it would be a lot easier to spin up a new indie game because you would be able to kind of basically outsource a lot of what you would have had to do yourself. You could say, hey, if, we're going to build this game, and you can just import, your characters and weapons and 3D models and all of that stuff from this. And all we're doing is providing like this new game dynamic or game mechanism in which we can play. And the reason I think gaming is interesting too, is because it is very abstract, right? Like Web3 is this weird, very abstract thing. And gaming, no one is pretending that gaming is, has like some sort of economic value and utility in terms of like, increasing like, life longevity, like whatever the metrics we define as useful are, sort of the economic utility framework like doesn't apply to video games, right? And so I think video games is definitely going to be something that we'll see. I also do think that like, I don't know if like I would love for like not maybe the publisher or the label, but estates potentially to get, once you do have like a hyper hit, I would love to see those things get fractionalized, right? Like once you do know, okay, there is like a Harry Potter here, right? Maybe the fans of Harry Potter should be able to participate in the upside of Harry Potter, not in the sense that they're, a DAO and they create, content for the universe and they get to like, but like just literally like own equity in the business of Harry Potter. And right now it's just not possible. Like LLCs, SEC limits, like it's just not possible. I would say venture is another one that I could see a lot of value in, and obviously DeFi and sort of the finance industry as well. I do think fine art is definitely compelling as well, collectibles. But I think gaming is probably the most apparent. And frankly, I think a lot of the unlock to crypto and Web3 has to come from the SEC. Like the SEC has to kind of come up with a framework that endorses these assets in a certain kind of way that allows for them to be tradable, kind of like equity. Otherwise, you're just never going to get, it's kind of like everyone's beating around the bush. Like we're all building the infrastructure without saying what we want to all say, which is like, please let us, let anyone invest in anything, right? Like we want anyone to be able to invest in startups, not just accredited investors. We want our stock to be liquid instead of it's super, super illiquid. We want price discovery. We want retail investors in. We don't want to wait. Like I'm trying to figure out how to IPO Gumroad right now. And like, it's funny. Last week I was in New York and I met with like someone who's on the board of the New York Stock Exchange. And I was like, how do I IPO Gumroad? And she's like, I don't know. I don't actually know what IPO, like, I know how, shipping code looks like, right? I know how to like launch a website. I know how to add Stripe to my, like, I know the process behind a lot of these things, but I don't actually know how to go public. Like there's no YouTube video I can watch. But effectively, that's what NFTs and what crypto and Uniswap and, tokens, et cetera, allow for, is you're effectively creating a tradable liquid asset, which is like taking a company public. And what I would love to see is if crypto, or maybe even crypto, just provides the pressure to the traditional ecosystem. I'm not sure exactly how this plays out. I do think like Gumroad, for example, made the traditional ecosystem more friendly to creators generally, even though maybe Gumroad didn't win all of that. Like I do think like sort of company ownership and equity is the largest market for crypto. Unfortunately, it's just so highly regulated that I don't know how that happens, but I do know that like Andreessen and Coinbase and everybody else is spending quite a lot of time and effort and energy making sure that the SEC, Congress, et cetera, know that, this is a huge opportunity for the US to stay number one.
It's funny, what you just said around going public and the ownership question also fits within the framework, because in the case here, you have a broken regulatory structure where you could see Web3 principles improving it. And also in this case, you actually are the customer in the sense that you have a company. The question is, how do I have some sort of liquidity of that? And you're like, if this regulatory structure could be fixed, this seems to be a really straightforward alternative that you would obviously choose over a weird, like maybe I'm not going to say obviously choose, but I just directionally see that once again. So I think people should really put a lot of thought into their.
Yeah. I mean, I did add really quickly to that. Like, yeah, as the customer, I think about, well, how do people want to trade Gumroad stock? Like they want it on Robinhood, right? Like what is, and often it is the traditional thing because that's what people are used to. And it's like, how do you blend the two together so that people, you don't have to, people are not going to get wallets and go to Uniswap and trade Gumroad tokens, right? Like, how do we get these two worlds working together? I think will lead to the best possible user experience and also kind of maintain like the best product, like the sort of tech stack underlying it will also be kind of like the most kind of efficient and transparent and open and these sorts of things.
So for our last question, I'm going to read from the publisher's just poll for the book because it's an interesting dynamic. The Minimalist Entrepreneur is a manifesto for a new generation of founders who'd rather build great companies than big ones. I would like you to speak to the generational aspect of every single thing we're talking about, right? So you starting Gumroad in 2011, visions of a unicorn, a big exit, all those different bits, probably a philanthropy somewhere down the line. That was a very 2011 vision. What is the world that you think the high schoolers who want to pick up this book, what world are they going into, and why do you suspect that's a world that's more conducive to a minimalist approach in certain categories?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it's a scary world right now, right? Like people, I think the traditional path was a lot more clear 10 years ago, where you got a degree from a university and then you moved to a big city and you got a job in a company and you proved yourself. And, maybe one day you started your own business or something like that. And nowadays, like, I don't know what's happening, right? Like there's remote universities, companies are no longer meeting in person. And so I don't know how you kind of climb even the career ladder. It's incredible. I mean, I'm so glad that honestly that I'm not, 18, 20 years old today. But I do think in this world, well, remote work, everyone can just start from anywhere. You can be pseudonymous even if you wanted to. And I think the right answer is, everyone should be one, be focused on building real valuable skills, right? Like learn how to write, learn how to design. If you can, learn how to code, like figure out what the fundamental skills are that are going to be valuable to society over the next 10 to 20 years. Obviously the traditional, plumbing, being a doctor, lawyer, these are still valuable skills, right? It's not just code. And then build an audience, like start writing your thoughts out there, start learning, start trying to figure out what, Naval calls specific knowledge, but really build an audience, because I do think like you have to, stand apart, even if you never use Gumroad or Substack. It's, as you mentioned, like it's going to give you leverage in those conversations. Like going viral on TikTok is going to get you a Hollywood deal or a Netflix deal, right? Like actually, frankly, it's the only way to get one of those, unless you come from your parents are part of the industry already, frankly, right? Like it's just, you need to kind of have leverage. And so, yeah, I think the simple, and then finally get financial capital somehow, right? Like, use those skills to kind of turn time into money with an hourly rate, and then ideally start a business, figure out how you can start scaling your time to make a higher and higher hourly rate over time. Eventually, hopefully that means running a software business. But it's kind of like the three kinds of capital, right? There's knowledge capital, which you start with, then there's social capital, and then there's financial capital, right? And ultimately, like, that's kind of like the ladder that people will need to climb in 2021. And it is, I think, more meritocratic than ever before. It's more democratized than ever before. It matters less kind of where you live, where you're from. However, what that also means, the flip of that is it's also more competitive than ever before, right? Because that's true for everybody else as well, not just you. And so I always recommend to people, like, you should start now, because it's going to get easier, but also it's going to get harder because you're going to have more competition that you're going to be competing with, because it's getting easier for everybody at the same time, right? And so, I would say that those are that's kind of how I would think about it. And certainly with crypto and Web3, I would be spending at least 20% of my time, kind of thinking about those sorts of things, getting deep into that stuff. And then honestly, don't save money. Like, try to deploy your capital in assets that are compounding, right? Whether that be startups, crowdfunding startups on Republic, whether that be crypto, whether that be just, you have to start making mistakes and training yourself, I think, in this way. And that really only comes from experience. Like, it's going to hurt, but ultimately, like, reading a book, even my book, is not going to get you all your answers. Like, you ultimately have to kind of like put all these things into practice to really learn what you need to learn.
Really well said. This has been a great episode. Once again, we'd love for you to shut off if you're watching this on YouTube, there's a huge poster of the book. So YouTubers, spare us a second.
Yeah.
For the audio listeners, what is the book? Full subtitle. Where should people go to find it?
Totally. It's the book is The Minimalist Entrepreneur: How Great Founders Do More with Less. It's available from all the traditional retailers, including Amazon. And you can kind of Google to find it, or you can check out my Twitter. Has the link in my bio. My Twitter handle is @SHL.
Great. Good show. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. It was super fun.